Greetings, friends, and welcome to another episode of Kirby Russia. I, radio talk show host and political analyst Tim Kirby, break down issues from a Russian standpoint. I've been here for 15 years, after all. I should be able to do that. But anyways, we're going to have a very interesting American perspective today from journalist and author Robert Bridge, who a few years ago wrote a very interesting book called Midnight in the American Empire. And we're going to talk about the status of America. Is America really in the midnight phase of its journey through life, or is a new dawn coming? We'll talk to Robert very soon. But for now, let's talk about midnight in the Soviet Union. Now, guys, one thing that's very important in discussing the end of the Soviet Union, the 80s, the sort of winding down of things, is that, or at least according to every source and every documentary that I've ever seen, no one really saw the true end of the Soviet Union coming. No one, I mean like the journalists en masse or big-time analysts. No one particularly wrote about that. Obviously, Gorbachev had a few things in his mind going on. But especially when you also take into account that there was a referendum to either save or get rid of the USSR at the time, and 77% of the population voted to keep the USSR. So when put to a referendum, even the population, even in sort of the dark, failing days of the 1980s, still said, let's give this communism thing one more shot. Just kind of mix it up a little bit, guys. So the populace was still ready, for the most part, to tolerate a lot more communism, which is actually kind of interesting. One thing we should learn from that is never ever put the future of your country and its territorial integrity up to some sort of stupid referendum. America, I'm looking at you, never do that. Bad idea. So in the future, guys, if they put America up for a referendum, maybe that's the true sign that it's midnight in the American empire. We also have to take into account that Russia's collapse was very big, didn't see it coming. Russia was the chief enemy of the Cold War. Communism definitely had its hand in one of the reasons as to why things had to change. But when you look to a little bit farther, China changed their communism, but North Korea and Cuba are still kind of going. I've had the chance to talk to Cubans who are sort of in the know about their own political system, and Cuba has done some reforms, but nothing even close to what the Chinese did. And yet they're still going. You would think that, especially during the crises of the fall of the Soviet Union, that North Korea and Cuba would have just been absolutely... Well, if Russia was shattered, they would have just been smashed into atoms, and yet they weren't. So it's really, really hard to predict when there's going to be some sort of major collapse. Or if we go and look at the British Empire, when exactly did the British Empire end? Was there kind of like an end date or end event? Before World War I, it was absolutely massive and very powerful. And then somewhere by the end of World War II, Britain really wasn't an empire anymore. But at what point? And that's also one of the things that makes it very hard to judge this. It's sort of a very gray process. There isn't this obvious start and end point. But long story short, there were certain signs that the Soviet Union wasn't working. We could get into a big, long arguments about the pluses and minuses of the Soviet economy, but overall, when fighting against the American economy of that time, it was definitely a minus. It wasn't able to compete with the United West's economy as a whole. So you had the economy was a major problem and its inability to adapt. The media went completely stale, along with ideology, because in a lot of ways, the ideology that was sort of being pumped on the masses, even to an extent during Stalin's time, really didn't change very much. And in some ways, you could have woken up in 1960 and then, woken up the next day at the end of the 1980s, and more or less everything was the same. The stability of the Soviet Union was something that people really longed for, but that absolute iron, unbending, ideological stagnation, especially with, the rise of pop music, the rise of the media, what would soon then be the internet, something had to shift, and it just didn't. So there was that. A lot of the policies about not allowing people to travel, limiting the amount of things that people had, Not that that would be particularly awful for the majority of us to have some sort of limits on our hedonism, but the elite certainly didn't like it. So, in a lot of ways, the enforced humility of the Soviet Union forcing everyone to be equal really motivated a lot of the elite to want to be rebellious, and the fact that many of them couldn't leave really motivated them even more. So there were definitely a very big long list of problems that eventually killed off the Soviet Union. But like I said, I don't know, Cuba has the same list. It had the same list to an extent, it kind of has. They've made some shifts on it, but still keeps going somehow. So are we in midnight of the American Empire? That's kind of hard to say. Let's take a listen to journalist and a longtime friend of mine, Robert Bridge, and hear what he has to say. Okay, Robert. So for starters, could you please tell us the thesis of your book, Midnight in the American Empire?
Because it's been a few years since I've written this book. Here it is right here, my Midnight in the American Empire. So I should just give a little bit of background, I guess, first, in that I worked for almost a decade for a large corporation in the United States, AT&T actually. I guess I can tell that. Although we signed a non-disclosure agreement, so there are some details I guess I shouldn't talk about. I don't think AT&T will drag me into court though anytime soon. But so, anyways, I worked for AT&T for, like I said, 10 years, and through that experience, which I can't say was a very pleasant one, I began thinking about corporations and how they operate, and the fact that I was in a union while I worked there, and I got to see firsthand how this all works and how it doesn't work. This kind of gave me the impetus, the inspiration to write this book. So it was a long project that it was something I thought about and for years, and then finally trying to put all those thoughts onto paper. It took a very long time, and so long actually that the publisher actually told me that I had to go back and change a lot of the data because it had become dated. So that also took some time. But I guess the thesis of it just boiled down to a nugget, is that it's just talking about democracy and in the corporations, how there is a lack of democracy in the corporations, I believe, and that how corporations have come to really transform the communities in the United States, not necessarily in a good way. You have the Walmartification now of communities and um, things like that, and how it's, in my opinion, and the opinion of many other people, much more intelligent than myself, say that it's to basically destroyed the feeling of community in communities. And so I guess that's basically the gist of it, something like that. And I also talk about some court cases that have helped to empower these corporations through the years, and to great negative effect to the American people, I believe.
Wait. What you said was kind of interesting. They always tell us that democracy is supposed to be the realm of the relationship between citizens and government. You kind of have a different take.
Well, it just to me, it just seems like if we're living in a democracy and we spend the majority of our times at our jobs, you would think that that democracy would also apply to our workplaces. And in a way that it kind of did when we had the notion of labor unions who would represent us. So this whole notion isn't necessarily uh, unheard of. That's how labor unions came into force, was because people wanted to have representatives, just like in the political realm, speaking for them, because they can't do this all the time. They can't think about all the different issues. If a comes against a worker, they want to have somebody who's there to help them and speak up for them. And I saw that in action quite a lot. Although, of course, there could be abuses of union power. I saw many people at my workplace, for example, they just they didn't care about their jobs. They knew that they were protected by their union bosses, and they didn't, they slagged off. Not everybody was like that, and you can make lots of cases against unions, but I think in general, what we've seen through the years since like the 1970s, when union representation within workplaces was about, I don't know, 35%, it's down to like 6% now in the private sector. you've seen just gross violations of worker protection laws, and people just don't have that protection anymore. You can fire workers, you can make them work like a dog, make them force them to work overtime, for example. Like when I was there, you couldn't make a person work overtime without having to compensate them. Now they could make you do overtime without caring about it. And another important thing, and just while it's on my mind, is vacation time. The United States happens to be the only country in the free world, maybe even in the unfree world, that has no vacation laws on the books. So these corporations can basically just say, "Hey, we're not going to give you a vacation." I mean, of course they do, but they give the bare minimum amount to the employees, and American workers now enjoy the least amount of vacation of anybody else in the world. So you can just look at those facts there as reasons why we need democracy in the workplace.
It always does bug me how certain groups stand up for the sanctity and the inalienable rights of the individual and how amazing he is until he punches it at work. Then he's just a piece of garbage that can be treated however the employer wants. But, anyways, Robert, you've had a few years to observe events after the release of your book. So, do you feel that your thesis has been confirmed, or has America started to maybe change in a different direction?
Well, when I wrote this, Tim, it was mostly about a lot of it was about the economic injustices. There's a whole chapter on that. Um, so that the economic part of it was a big part of it. And but looking back, I'd probably call the book maybe Morning in the American Empire. The way things are going now, the things that corporations are able to get away with. It's not only corporations, but I mean, sticking to that subject, you see what they're doing now. They're promoting things that I could never have imagined. For Gillette, for example, promoting their toxic masculinity commercials. Sprite promoting their transgender commercials. Things like this. They've become more like social activists in the political realm as opposed to simply being limited in the economic realm and just selling us products. Now they're trying to get people to change their opinions. They're becoming very powerful political players. There was a court case, Citizens United, back in 2000 something. I can't remember the exact date, but that just opened up the floodgates for corporations to dump money into the political election system, and they could really influence things that way, to the point when you have a case now where politicians, they're no longer really representing the people. If it was ever the case before, they're representing the corporations. Before it was probably they're representing the railroads. Now they're representing top 10, top 20 companies that provide 95% of our goods and services. So the whole notion of democracy now, it's just a complete sham. And corporations have. I remember, I think it was Jesse Ventura. He made a great statement one time. He said that politicians, when they enter into Congress, they should wear, like, you see the NASCAR drivers, they all have their patches on them from different companies that sponsor them. He said that politicians should walk into Congress wearing those patches on them. And I totally agree. These guys are just completely bought out, and there's no representation left for the people.
Not only are they bought out, but the level of intellect of congressmen seems to be shocking. It is amazing just how little those trust fund kids got from their Ivy League educations. But anyway, speaking of politicians that have failed their nations, let's take a look at some of the other big collapses of history. The Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Soviet Empire. So, would the potential collapse of America be something similar to these other historic collapses, or is America truly exceptional in this regard?
Well, we like to believe that we're exceptional, and in some ways, I suppose we are, but not probably for the moral reasons that we like to believe. Exceptional in the case that we've really, truly gone global. The Roman Empire in their day, they were global, but the world was a much smaller place then, and they were defeated by barbarians at the gates. We're in the United States today. We're letting so-called, I hate to use the word barbarians, but we're letting illegals into our country, and we seem to think that that's a great thing, that that's going to It's going to increase our diversity and make us more powerful. You had the Soviet Empire. Uh, the Soviets, and I have to really give them a lot of credit. We call them the evil empire, but when the Russians and the rest of the countries understood that the game was up, they didn't want to drag the whole world down with them. They understood that, okay, it's not working anymore. We got to give this up and try something different, and they did, and they made the transition. Although, albeit it was a terribly difficult one, millions of people died in that transition. Probably still suffering today, trying to make the transition from communism to capitalism. But they did make the transition. But the United States and the American empire, I don't see us ever giving up the empire without bringing down the entire world with it. And I have lots of personal, well, I don't know if I can call them personal, but I have reasons why that's the case. It's just so much. It's almost become like a religious cult, this whole American empire, and we believe that we have to spread our message across the world, and that only we can save the planet. And you got a lot of powerful forces behind the scenes, even up to and including secret societies. It's just unbelievable. You've got all these groups that it's a so-called democracy, but yet if you look at all the hands behind the scenes, um, you could start naming some. Bilderberg Group, for example, Bohemian Grove, Skull and Bones. You look at these groups, and these people they're very much dedicated and to promoting this new world order agenda, and it's been talked about quite a lot. It's getting a lot more press again, and I think that this idea it's flourishing not only in the United States, but in groups around the world and governments around the world, and I think that's a real danger. And so it's not just like, for example, the Soviet Union, that was kind of limited in its scope, although very huge, of course. You had two sides opposing each other, but yeah, with the American empire, it's a whole different story.
Now, there have been a lot of doom and gloom books written about America over the decades, most of which have been proven to be bad predictions. Now, your book was very different from those in that you relate the ills of American society to just a handful of Supreme Court rulings. That's interesting. And most importantly, that's a problem that's very, very fixable. So, could you please tell us about some of these Supreme Court cases and how they hurt America so deeply?
I can't say that I'm a legal scholar, but doing my own personal research and following up on the research of other people, yeah, I did come to the conclusion that corporate America, they have a lot of court cases that back them. And for example, the main one, well, not the main one, but one of the first ones was the Dartmouth College case. Okay, I won't get into all the details because I know this legal stuff is boring as heck. But basically, it was, and I'm reading from my book here because I don't recall all this stuff offhand, like a typical lawyer would. So forgive me. But this was basically the state of New Hampshire. They sought to revoke a charter that had been issued to Dartmouth College, okay, in the days before the United States had won its independence from the British Crown, okay. And in the court case, in the court ruling, the Chief Justice, whose name was John Marshall, he included this very encompassing definition of what he believed a corporation was, and this set a precedent. That's what it's considered to be today, which is, and if I could read the part of this to you, it's kind of astonishing. It says that a corporation is an artificial being. It's invisible, intangible, and existing only in the contemplation of the law. Being a mere creature of law, it possesses only those properties which the charter of its creation confers upon it, either expressly or as incidental to its very existence, blah, 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 blah. They enable a corporation to manage its own affairs and to hold property without the perplexing intricacies, the hazardous and endless necessity of perpetual conveyances, and it goes on and on. So it's kind of astounding that they could call something like a corporation, which is a very physical thing, of course. I mean, it's concrete. We can look at it. We can see the brand. We can see the logo. We see the employees going in, but yet it's considered to be invisible and artificial. So that just set the tone for other court cases down the road. Next one being, I'm not going to go too in depth. Like I said, I don't want to bore your listeners here. But in 1886, the Supreme Court went one step further in empowering the corporations in the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad case. Okay, this is really an unbelievable one, where it was decided that private corporations are entitled to the rights found in the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is basically personhood. This grants, so basically what this did was, and it's really sneaky how they got this to pass through. It's unbelievable, and it probably would be grounds. You talked about a way that maybe there's a way to go back and redo these court cases or rescind them. This might be one way, because the court reporter in the case, his name was Bancroft Davis. This is unbelievable. He attached a comment after the case had been recorded and everything was finished and they had the documents all drafted. He attached a comment into the head note of the case, and where he said the defendant corporations are persons within the intent of the clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which forbids a state to deny any person, that is a corporation, within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Okay, then he goes on to write, the court does not wish to hear argument on the question whether the provision in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which forbids a state to deny to any person within its jurisdiction all the equal protections of the law, we are of the opinion that it does. Okay, so in just that one paragraph, this one individual, and Bancroft, this is another interesting thing, Bancroft Davis was just no ordinary person. He had been the president of the Newburgh and New York Railway Company. So somehow he got to be the court reporter there to attach that addendum to this court ruling, which has had serious implications on corporate power, and something that's not talked about. I would imagine most people don't. I didn't know about that until I started researching it. Media certainly doesn't talk about it, and the implications are just massive when you bless the corporation not only with invisibility and artificiality, but with personhood. So this is just unbelievable. The powers that they possess.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how in our system you can't have rights for any sort of group, but you can have them for an invisible, made-up entity. So we have the rugged individual against these giant entities. And when you're General Electric or Lockheed Martin or Microsoft, guess who wins in that battle of rights? Not me, that's for sure. So the question is, if the Supreme Court caused all this insanity, are they really the battleground for making change? Is the future of America in the hands of 9 people in weird black robes?
Yeah, that's a big question right now, and the Democrats, of course, they see it as a big problem with Amy Barrett just being sworn in. Well, not just, but last year under Donald Trump. Yeah, the Kavanaugh case, which was just a fiasco. So it would be nice to know that the Supreme Court was completely neutral, but of course that's not the case. These are individuals with their own opinions, their own views, whether they be liberal or conservative. So the Democrats now, they're talking about loading up the Supreme Court in order to, because right now they're in the minority, so to speak. And actually, that's how George W. Bush became president, was through the Supreme Court. He back in 2000, they violated. I guess you could say they violated the well, they followed the Constitution, but it's just ridiculous how it happened, to the whole recount, and it ended up being that the Supreme Court are the ones who Supreme Court justices are the ones who actually voted him into office, selected him into office by a 5-4 margin, I believe. So it's a huge question. Should the Supreme Court justices be able to rule like Ruth Ginsburg until in her late 80s, 90, whatever? or waiting just until they die under strange circumstances, as was the case with Antonio Scalio, who died with a pillow over his face at night in a hunting lodge somewhere. If you remember that story. So it's a really good question. Should they serve life terms or not? Should they be just, you're talking about law of the land, so I can kind of understand how they don't want this to be just a 4-year term or an 8-year term. You want people in there who are going to make long-term decisions, hopefully not based just upon their political beliefs, but unfortunately that's what it's coming down to. The Democrats right now are furious about that. They're going to try to do something, load the bench, I suppose. So it's going back and forth. Of course, like everything in American politics, nothing is straightforward. You're always going to have this tension. And kind of drifting off into the subject of Russia, that's what I really like about Russia, is that you don't have this back and forth. Things are much more straightforward. You want to. Seems like the people have much more say. The opinions of the people seem to really matter, and which I know might sound, I don't know, ironic to some listeners.
Robert also lives out here with me in Russia, so I'm kind of curious to hear his opinion about how American and Russian democracy differ from each other.
Well, one thing that strikes me about being here in Russia is how fast legislation can get through. Okay, and I'll give you one example. Maybe the most famous example is Vladimir Putin's so-called they called it in the West the anti-gay law. Okay, but it was anything but that. It was a law passed several years ago with enlightening speed, where they basically just said that they want to prevent children from being exposed to any sort of sexual messages, children under the age of 18. All right, that includes in the classroom, through commercials, through TV shows. Okay, no discussions about alternative lifestyles, no promoting, not even just promoting regular, I guess heterosexual relationships. There's a place for that. And now I thought to myself, after seeing this pass through the Duma, like I said, in lightning speed, a few days, and by a huge majority of the legislators, not in the Russian population, 90 some percent of the people supported it. Now, can you imagine that type of legislation trying to get through Congress? What that would require to do something like that? And to me, it's such a common sense thing. It's just based purely on common sense. You don't need children thinking about these types of things at a young age. When they become 18, okay, fine, they can think about it all they want, or maybe even 16, they can start having these types of educational classes, talking about it a little bit. But to throw these types of topics at children about transgender, this is just completely confusing children. They're not mature enough to handle these types of subjects at these ages. Nor is the school the place to be handling these types of things, nor are commercials, for example, like Sprite came out with their transgender commercial. I mean, come on, this is ridiculous. Let children be children. Let them come to their own conclusions through their own ways. If they have any questions, let them talk to their parents. There's no need for the school system to be promoting these things, which is what's happening in the United States right now, which is to me extremely disturbing, that they're promoting and talking about these things. The school books, the textbooks, what I'm seeing and hearing, it's just incredible. I mean, the most degraded things that you can imagine. And that would never fly in Russia and many other countries, Hungary, and many other places. In Europe, many countries there, I'm seeing that it would, and that's disturbing. And that's why I look at Russia as this bastion of sanity, if you will, against this tide of Western liberalism that is just, in many ways, honestly insane. You see the things that they're promoting, the types of teachers that are promoting this stuff, the things that are important to these teachers. It's literally insanity, and I don't see how it's going to promote the good of the nation, the country. The main purpose of education is of course, it's just to receive an education, get your kids prepared for the world. I'm not talking about what pronoun they are or things like that. It's absurd, and you don't have that in Russia. And I hope to God that it stays that way.